Mechanic fired. After 30 years, weeks later, he returns, and everyone freezes. Frank Sullivan had spent 30 years in the same garage. 30 years of grease-stained hands, busted knuckles, and long nights under the hood of a car. He had built that place from the ground up, turning a small-town auto shop into one of the most trusted names in the city. Customers did not just come for repairs. They came because they knew Frank would not cheat them. But none of that mattered today, because today he was being thrown out like garbage. "Thank you so much, Frank," Mrs. Jenkins said, her relief evident as she took her keys. "My son told me to go to that new place across town, said they're cheaper, but I told him Frank's the only one who touches my car. You're the only mechanic who's never tried to sell me something I don't need." Frank smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "Just a loose belt connection, nothing serious. Should run smooth now." As Mrs. Jenkins drove away, Frank noticed Greg Miller watching from the office window. The new owner had been eyeing him differently lately, calculating cold. When old man Carter passed away 6 months ago, everything changed. The shop's soul seemed to leave with him. "Sullivan, office now." Greg's voice crackled over the intercom. The other mechanics glanced up, their expressions a mix of concern and curiosity. Mike, who Frank had trained from his first day, gave him a worried look. "Probably wants me to explain why I didn't charge Mrs. Jenkins for a full belt replacement," Frank muttered, wiping his hands one final time before heading to the office. Greg Miller's office was nothing like when Carter ran things. Gone were the family photos and the old couch where customers could sit comfortably. Now there were charts showing profit margins and a sleek desk that looked like it cost more than what Frank made in 3 months. "Close the door," Greg said without looking up from his computer. At 35, he wore designer clothes that had never seen a drop of motor oil. His MBA diploma hung prominently on the wall, his pride and joy. Frank stood waiting, his work boots leaving slight marks on the pristine carpet. Finally, Greg leaned back in his expensive chair, tapping his pen against the desk. "I'm sorry, Frank. Business is business." His tone was casual, like he was asking Frank to pass the salt at dinner. Frank's stomach dropped. "What are you talking about?" "We're restructuring, streamlining operations. I'm afraid your position is being eliminated." Frank clenched his jaw, the muscles tightening. 30 years, Greg. I trained half the guys in that shop. I kept this place running when Carter got sick, worked 16-hour days when we were short-staffed. And you're just letting me go?" Greg sighed like this was exhausting for him. "Look, you're great at what you do, no doubt. But times are changing. We need younger mechanics who can work faster, take lower wages. I have investors to answer to. It's not personal." "Not personal." Frank felt a tightness in his chest, but he refused to let Greg see it. He wouldn't give in the satisfaction. The faces of loyal customers flashed through his mind. People who specifically asked for him, who trusted him with their vehicles, their safety. "So what now?" Frank asked, his voice steady despite the storm inside. "You expect me to pack up my tools and walk out like I was never here?" Greg shrugged. "Pretty much. There's a severance package, a few months' pay. Consider it a thank you for your service." Frank let out a slow breath, his hands balled into fists, but he forced himself to stay calm. Greg wasn't worth losing his dignity over. He turned, heading for the door. But just before he stepped out, he stopped. He looked over his shoulder, his voice low but firm. "You just made the worst mistake of your life." Greg chuckled, shaking his head. "We'll see about that." Frank walked out without looking back. By the time he got to his station, his toolbox was already packed. His name, the one that had been on a plaque above his workspace for decades, was gone, erased. The younger mechanics barely made eye contact as he walked by. Some of them looked guilty, others relieved it wasn't them. Danny, a 23-year-old who Frank had spent countless hours mentoring, stepped forward hesitantly. "This isn't right, Frank. You taught me everything I know." "Keep your head down, kid," Frank whispered. "Do good work. That's all that matters in the end." Outside, the cold wind hit his face as he stepped into the parking lot. His old truck sat in the same spot it always had, but this time it felt different. He wasn't coming back. Frank threw his toolbox into the truck bed and got in. He gripped the steering wheel, staring ahead at the garage where customer cars were lined up waiting. People who would ask for him and be told he was gone. 30 years of his life gone in minutes. He turned the key, the engine rumbling to life. As he pulled away, he glanced in his rearview mirror. Through the garage windows, he could see Greg already showing a young mechanic Frank's old station. His replacement hadn't even waited for his truck to leave the lot. Frank drove aimlessly for hours, the city lights blurring past his windshield. His hand stayed tight on the wheel, knuckles white. 30 years in one place, and now he had nowhere to go. The thought burned in his chest like a fire he couldn't put out. He hadn't just lost a job, he'd lost his purpose. At a stoplight, he noticed a family in the car next to him. The father pointed at Frank's truck, mouthing, "Aren't you from Carter's?" Frank turned away, unable to explain that he wasn't anymore. That after 3 decades of fixing their vehicles, keeping their families safe on the road, he had been discarded like a worn-out part. He finally pulled into the driveway of his small house, the same one he had lived in for 20 years. The porch light flickered as he stepped out of the truck, toolbox in hand. Inside, the silence hit him hard. No sound of an engine running, no smell of oil or metal, just emptiness and the ticking of a clock on the wall marking time he suddenly had too much of. He set his toolbox down on the kitchen table and sank into a chair. His hands ran through his graying hair. He had never planned for this. He had always thought he would retire from that garage, maybe train a new generation, pass down the knowledge he had built over the years. But Greg had taken that from him in seconds. His eyes landed on an old photo hanging on the wall. Him and Carter, the original owner of the shop, standing in front of the garage when they first opened it. Carter had been more than a boss. He had been a mentor, a friend, someone who had believed in hard work and loyalty. If he were alive today, he would be ashamed of what had happened. Frank clenched his jaw and looked away. The refrigerator was nearly empty. He usually grabbed lunch at the diner near the shop. His life had revolved around that garage for so long that now, without it, he felt like a planet knocked out of orbit, spinning into the cold unknown. He needed to figure out what was next. But tonight, sitting alone in his kitchen with 30 years of memories weighing on his shoulders, tomorrow seemed impossibly far away. The next morning, Frank woke up early out of habit, his body's internal clock still set to garage time. For a moment, lying in bed, he forgot, reached for his work clothes before reality crashed back. No job to go to, no cars waiting for his skilled hands. He dressed anyway, unable to break the routine of 3 decades. The coffee tasted bitter as he sat at his kitchen table, staring at his calloused hands. Hands that could diagnose an engine problem by touch alone, that customers had trusted with their family vehicles for years. "What the hell am I supposed to do now?" he muttered to the empty room. His small house seemed to close in around him. The walls were decorated with framed certificates from automotive training courses, photos of him at the shop through the years, even a shelf of trophies from local car shows where he'd restored vintage models. His entire identity hung on these walls, and now it felt like looking at someone else's life. A thought crossed his mind. He grabbed his phone and scrolled through his contacts. There had to be someone, some shop, some old friend who needed a mechanic. One by one, he called the numbers. One by one, he got the same answer. "We're not hiring. Budgets are tight. We'll keep you in mind. Sorry, Frank, we're looking for someone younger." That last one stung the most. From Jackson over at Precision Auto, a guy he'd known for 15 years. Frank exhaled sharply, setting the phone down. He had never felt this useless in his life. 55 wasn't old. Not really. But in this business, with new computerized systems and diagnostic tools, shops wanted technicians fresh out of school who'd work for half his salary. "To hell with this," he muttered, grabbing his truck keys. He wouldn't sit here wallowing. That afternoon, he drove around town, stopping by every shop he could find. Some places had kids barely out of school working the bays. Others had owners who looked at his age and saw a liability, not an asset. Hours passed, and hope drained from him with every rejection. As he sat in his truck outside the last shop on his list, something caught his eye, a small, run-down garage on the edge of town. The sign was faded, barely readable, and the lot was empty, but Frank recognized the name. It had belonged to an old mechanic he used to know, someone who had been around as long as him. He pulled into the lot, curiosity tugging at him. The building looked abandoned, but the door was unlocked. Inside, the place was a mess, dust-covered tools, broken-down cars, and an air of neglect. It looked like no one had worked here in years. Frank ran his fingers along a workbench, leaving trails in the dust. The equipment was outdated but solid, built in an era when things were made to last. The hydraulic lift was rusted but intact. The tool chests were old but sturdy. And then an idea sparked in his mind. He had spent 30 years building someone else's business. Maybe it was time to build his own. Frank stood in the middle of the dusty garage, his boots planted firmly on the cracked concrete floor. The place smelled like old oil and forgotten potential. He ran a hand over a rusted toolbox, his fingers tracing the outline of something that had once been great but had been left to rot. He could feel in his bones. This place had history, the kind that couldn't be bought, only earned. For years, he had put his sweat and soul into making Greg's shop the best in town. And where had that gotten him? Tossed aside, forgotten. But this was different. Frank walked to the garage door and shoved it open. The sunlight streamed in, illuminating the dust swirling in the air. He could almost see it, the way it could be. Cars lined up outside, people bringing their vehicles to someone they could trust. A mechanic who wouldn't cheat them. His own shop. The thought made his pulse quicken. But then reality settled in. It was a wreck. The equipment was outdated, the lift was rusted, and who knew if the wiring even worked. It would take more money than he had just to get it running. And then there was the biggest problem, customers. How would he get people to trust a new shop when Greg's business had a chokehold on the entire town? Most of Frank's old customers still went there, and Greg would make sure none of them left. Frank exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe he was just chasing a dream that was never going to happen. Then he heard the sound of tires rolling up outside. His stomach tensed. No one should be here. He stepped outside and saw an old man climbing out of a beat-up pickup truck. His clothes were worn, his face weathered, but Frank recognized him instantly. Tom Reed. Frank hadn't seen him in years, but he had once been a legend in the industry. He had owned a shop back in the day, one that people drove miles just to visit because they knew he was the best. Frank had learned a lot from watching him work. "Thought I might find you here," Tom said, his voice gruff but warm. "Marcy down at the diner told me what happened. Said you looked like someone had kicked your dog when you came in for breakfast." Frank managed a small smile. News travels fast. Always does in a town like this. Tom's gaze shifted toward the garage. "So what are you doing here? This place has been empty since old Johnson died." Frank hesitated. "Just looking, I guess." Tom walked past him into the garage, his experienced eyes scanning the space. "Needs work. Lots of it." He kicked at a pile of debris. "But the bones are good. Even if I fix this place up," Frank said, following him inside, "no one's going to come. Greg's already taken them all." Tom turned, fixing Frank with a hard stare. "That what you really think? That people went to Carter's all these years because of the name on the door? They went because of you, Frank. Because they knew you wouldn't screw them over." Frank wanted to believe that, but after 2 weeks of rejections, his confidence was shaken. "I don't have the money to get this place running anyway." Tom nodded, as if he had expected that answer. Then he walked to the back of his truck, lifted the tailgate, and pulled out a battered toolbox. "I say we change that." Frank frowned. "We?" Tom grinned. "I might be old, but I still know my way around an engine. And I got something Greg doesn't." Frank raised an eyebrow. Tom patted the toolbox. "Loyal customers who've been waiting for a reason to leave that place. Plus," he reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. "I've been saving for a fishing boat for 10 years. Figure this might be a better investment." Frank stood there, staring at Tom, the weight of the moment sinking in. This wasn't just some passing conversation. Tom meant business. And if there was one thing Frank had learned in his 30 years as a mechanic, it was that men like Tom didn't waste time on lost causes. Frank exhaled, glancing back at the dusty garage. "You really think people will come here?" Tom smirked. "They will if they know you're running it. People are tired of Greg's nonsense. They just need an excuse to walk away." Frank wanted to believe that, but starting a shop from the ground up was no small feat. It required money, tools, equipment, things he didn't have. Tom must have read his mind. He opened his toolbox and pulled out a faded checkbook. I got some savings. Not much, but enough to get this place running. Frank's eyes widened. Tom, I can't take your money. You're not taking it. I'm investing in a shop that actually cares about people. You fix the cars, I'll handle the business side. Tom clapped a hand on Frank's shoulder. We'll make this work. Frank swallowed hard. He had spent the last 2 weeks feeling like his life was over, but here was Tom, handing him a lifeline, a second chance. He looked at the garage one more time, picturing it not as the rundown mess it was, but as the thriving shop it could be. He saw himself working again, helping people, doing what he loved. He saw purpose. He turned back to Tom. All right, let's do this. Tom's weathered face broke into a wide grin. Well then, partner, we've got work to do. He reached into his truck and pulled out a broom, starting with getting 30 years of dust out of our shop. Our shop. The words echoed in Frank's mind as he took the broom. For the first time since being fired, he felt something stir in his chest. Not anger or bitterness, but hope. A spark that had almost died was flickering back to life. And just like that, the spark was lit. For the next few days, Frank and Tom got to work. They cleaned out the garage, scrubbing years of dust and grime from every surface. Frank's muscles ached in places he'd forgotten about, but it was a good pain, the kind that came from purpose. Hand me that socket wrench, Frank called from underneath the ancient hydraulic lift. Oil dripped onto his forehead as he tightened the final bolt. This baby hasn't been serviced since Bush was president. The first one. Tom slid the wrench across the floor. You sure you can get it working again? Frank grunted, making one final adjustment before sliding out. These old Challenger lifts were built like tanks. Just needed to replace the hydraulic seals and clean out the cylinders. He stood up, wiping his hands on a rag. Let's test it. He flipped the switch, holding his breath. The lift groaned, then slowly, painfully slowly, began to rise. Both men watched in silence until it reached full extension, where it held steady. Would you look at that? Tom whispered, a smile breaking across his weathered face. Frank patted the lift control like it was an old friend. Told you, they don't make M like this anymore. While Frank repaired equipment, Tom made calls to old contacts, securing deals on used diagnostic machines, oil drums, and parts inventory. He negotiated payment terms that wouldn't break their limited budget, calling in favors from suppliers who remembered when his word was as good as a signed contract. Got us a deal on that brake lathe, Tom announced one afternoon, hanging up his phone. Guy owes me from when I helped his son get started in the business. So we can pay him when we start turning a profit. Frank looked up from rewiring the overhead lights. People still do business like that. The good ones do. Tom smiled. Not everyone's like Greg. By the end of the first week, they had transformed the main bay. The floors were clean, the equipment functional, and a fresh coat of paint brightened the walls. Frank had spent evenings after Tom went home rewiring the electrical system, making sure every outlet and light worked to code. We need a name, Tom said one morning, standing outside looking at the faded sign. Frank thought for a moment. What about Sullivan and Reed's? Simple, just our names. Tom shook his head. Nah, people need to know what we stand for. He was quiet for a moment. How about Honest Mechanics? Says exactly what we are. Frank smiled. I like it. Word started to spread. A few curious onlookers stopped by, watching as the old garage came back to life. Some were Frank's old customers, wondering where he'd gone after suddenly disappearing from Carter's. So this is where you ended up, said Bill Thompson, whose family's vehicles Frank had maintained for 15 years. Greg told everyone you retired and moved to Florida. Frank's jaw tightened. Not exactly. Well, I'm glad I found you. My Chevy's making that noise again, the one only you seem to understand. Before Frank could respond, Tom stepped forward, extending his hand. We're not officially open yet, but for an old customer like you, I think we can make an exception. Right, Frank? And just like that, they had their first customer. Bill's truck sat in a newly cleaned bay, Frank's experienced hands diagnosing the issue within minutes. The familiar rhythm of work settled over him. The methodical check of systems, the careful listening for irregular sounds, the satisfaction of identifying the problem. Your harmonic balancer is starting to separate, Frank explained, pointing to the rubber isolation layer that was beginning to crack. It's why you're getting that vibration at highway speeds. Bill nodded. Greg's guys told me I needed a whole new front end. Quoted me $1,200. Frank shook his head. Balancer's about $150 in parts. 2 hours labor. We'll have you back on the road by tomorrow afternoon. Bill's relief was visible. This is why I always ask for you, Frank. When Bill left, promising to return the next day, Frank and Tom exchanged looks. They didn't need to say it aloud. This was just the beginning. The next morning, a woman pulled up in a minivan, her face tense with worry. I heard you were open. My car's been making a noise, but Greg's shop told me it would take 2 weeks just to look at it. The kids have soccer practice, and I can't be without a car that long. Frank nodded. Pop the hood. Within minutes, he diagnosed the issue, a loose belt, a 10-minute fix. When he handed the keys back, she was stunned. Greg told me I needed a full repair. He was going to charge me hundreds. Frank wiped his hands on a rag. You're good to go. No charge for something that small. Her eyes filled with gratitude. I'm telling everyone about this place. And she did. Within hours, more cars started rolling in. People came complaining about how Greg had overcharged them, how he had pushed unnecessary repairs. Frank and Tom worked tirelessly, fixing cars honestly and fairly. The trust was coming back. By the end of the second week, they had a steady stream of customers. Tom had set up a simple booking system on an old computer, and they were scheduled solid for days. They still needed more tools, better diagnostic equipment, and probably another mechanic to help with the load, but they were making it work. We need to order more brake pads, Frank called to Tom one evening as he finished up the day's last oil change. And that shipment of filters still hasn't arrived. Tom made a note. I'll call in the morning. Oh, and Mrs. Peterson dropped off cookies. Said it's a thank you for fixing her daughter's car last weekend. Frank smiled. This was how a garage should be run, with community, trust, and honest work at its center. For the first time since being fired, he felt truly at peace. But Greg was not happy. That evening, as Frank locked up, a black luxury car pulled into the lot. The door swung open, and out stepped Greg, his face unreadable, but his eyes burning with something Frank couldn't quite place. Greg took a slow step forward, surveying the renovated garage. So this is what you've been up to. Frank crossed his arms. You seem surprised. Greg smirked, but there was no humor in it. You know, when I let you go, I thought you'd just retire. Maybe find a hobby. He glanced around at the cars waiting to be serviced. I didn't expect competition. Not everything is about competition, Greg. Some things are about doing what's right. Tom stepped up beside Frank. The only mistake was thinking you could keep running a business by cheating people. Greg's jaw tightened. You're not going to last. This town isn't big enough for 2 auto shops. Frank met his stare. We'll see about that. Greg chuckled darkly, then climbed back into his car. Before closing the door, he paused. You should have stayed retired, Frank. This won't end well for you. As Greg drove off, Tom exhaled. He's not done yet. Frank nodded. He knew Greg too well. This was just the beginning. The next morning, Frank arrived at the shop early, eager to get started on a transmission rebuild he'd promised to finish by noon. But something fell off as he approached. The front door was wide open. The lock had been busted. His heart pounded as he rushed inside. Tools were scattered everywhere, drawers yanked open. The register was missing. His toolbox, the one he had owned for decades, was gone. Diagnostic equipment was smashed, oil dumped across the floor, and the computer with their appointment system had been taken. Tom ran in behind him, stopping dead in his tracks. No, he scanned the wreckage, his face tightening with rage. Frank clenched his fists. He knew exactly who had done this. Greg. It was the only explanation. Greg had seen the shop rising, customers leaving his garage to come here. He had warned Frank that he wouldn't last, and now this. Tom kicked a broken chair aside. We need to call the cops. Frank exhaled sharply, shaking his head. We have no proof. He'll deny everything. So we just let this go? Tom was fuming, his face red with anger. Frank looked around at the destruction, his chest heavy. No, he said finally. We clean up. We rebuild. And we open for business today, even if I have to work with a hammer and a screwdriver. Tom stared at him. You're serious? Dead serious. Frank picked up a wrench from the floor. Greg thinks this will break us. I'm going to show him what 30 years of determination looks like. By noon, word had spread through town. Customers arrived, gasping at the state of the shop. One woman, Mrs. Carter, no relation to Frank's old boss, crossed her arms, surveying the damage. Greg did this, didn't he? She asked, her voice hard. Frank didn't confirm it, but his silence was enough. People whispered, shaking their heads in disgust. Then something unexpected happened. A few men stepped forward. We're not letting him get away with this. We'll help you rebuild. Frank's throat tightened. He'd spent 30 years working for a company that tossed him aside. And now, after just a few weeks, people were standing up for him. By the end of the day, the shop was cleaner than ever. Someone donated tools. Another dropped off a new register. A local computer store provided a replacement system, preloaded with scheduling software. The town had spoken. Greg had tried to destroy them. Instead, he had given them more strength. As the last volunteer left, Frank turned to Tom. I never expected this. Tom smiled, clapping a hand on Frank's shoulder. You spent 30 years taking care of people's cars, making sure their families were safe on the road. Did you really think they wouldn't remember that? But Greg was not finished yet. That night, as Frank locked up the newly restored shop, he noticed a car parked across the street. Headlights off, a figure sitting inside, watching. Frank turned to Tom, his expression grim. We need to be ready. He's not done. Tom nodded, his eyes hard. Let him try. This time, we'll be prepared. The next morning, Frank arrived at the shop early, his mind still on the car that had been watching them the night before. He had a feeling this was far from over. As he unlocked the front door, he paused to check the new security cameras Tom had installed. Small, but visible deterrents mounted at each corner of the building. Inside, Frank ran his hand along the workbench, now restored and organized with replacement tools donated by the community. The shop felt different this morning, stronger somehow, as if the break-in had only reinforced its foundation rather than weakened it. We're not just rebuilding a garage, he murmured to himself. We're making a statement. As he flipped on the lights and started the morning routine, checking the appointment book, warming up the diagnostic computers, preparing the service bays, a sense of determination settled over him. Greg could try to scare them, try to break them, but he would not win. Tom arrived a few minutes later, carrying 2 coffees from the diner across town. Dark circles under his eyes suggested he hadn't slept much. You sleep at all? Frank asked, taking the offered cup. Tom chuckled, shaking his head. Too much on my mind. Frank nodded, understanding completely. Same here. Tom settled into the small office chair, pulling out his phone. Well, get ready, because we're about to get real busy. Frank frowned. What do you mean? Tom smirked, scrolling through his messages. People are talking, Frank. Word spread all over town about what happened. They know what Greg did, and they're done with him. I've been getting messages all morning. People want their cars fixed, and they want you to do it. Frank barely had time to respond before he heard the sound of tires on gravel. A car pulled up outside, then another and another. Within minutes, the lot was full, more vehicles than they'd seen since opening. One man stepped forward, a tall construction worker named Pete, who Frank recognized from Carter's. He extended his hand, gripping Frank's firmly. I've been going to Greg for years, but not anymore. I'm not giving my money to someone who tries to destroy honest people. A woman behind him nodded vigorously. Same here. He charged me for a repair I didn't even need. I should have come here sooner. Frank looked at the growing crowd, overwhelmed. People weren't just bringing their business. They were bringing their trust, their solidarity. We can't possibly handle all these cars today, Frank whispered to Tom. Tom grinned. Then we'll schedule them. Make appointments. Build a waiting list. These people aren't going anywhere, Frank. They're here to stay. For the next few hours, Frank and Tom worked nonstop, fixing cars, changing oil, replacing tires, diagnosing problems. Every time Frank looked up from under a hood, more cars were pulling in. The phone rang constantly with people asking if they were open, if they could bring their vehicles in. By midday, they had to start turning people away, promising appointments later in the week. Tom had filled their schedule for the next 2 weeks solid. We need to hire help, Tom said during a rare, quiet moment as they wolfed down sandwiches brought by a grateful customer. We can't keep up with this demand ourselves. Frank nodded, wiping his hands on a shop rag. I was thinking the same thing. Just then, the door opened. A young man walked in. Danny, the apprentice from Carter's who had spoken to Frank on his last day. I heard what happened, Danny said, looking around at the busy shop. Greg's been impossible since you left, making us cut corners, rushing jobs. He hesitated. I quit this morning. Told him I couldn't work that way anymore. Frank studied the young man's face. And I was wondering if you might need some help around here. I know I'm still learning, but when can you start? Tom interrupted, a smile spreading across his face. Danny's eyes widened. Really? Today? Now. Frank handed him a shop rag. Bay 3. Oil change and tire rotation. Let's see if you remember what I taught you. As Danny hurried to work, Tom leaned closer to Frank. That's just the beginning. I bet half of Greg's staff will jump ship by the end of the month. Frank wasn't so sure, but he appreciated Tom's optimism. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. We still have a lot of work to do. The afternoon brought more customers, more stories of Greg's dishonest practices, more gratitude for Frank's return to the business. Each person who walked through the door seemed genuinely relieved to find a mechanic they could trust. Mrs. Rodriguez, whose family ran the local bakery, clasped Frank's oil-stained hand in both of hers. My husband and I were just saying last week how much we missed having you work on our delivery van. No one else understands that old engine like you do. An elderly man named Howard, who Frank had been servicing his classic Mustang for decades, brought in a box of tools. These are my father's. I've been holding on to them, but they should be used by someone who appreciates quality. The day blurred into a whirlwind of activity: diagnostics, repairs, scheduling, ordering parts. Frank moved from car to car, his experienced hands working with the precision and care that had earned him his reputation. Tom managed the front, handling customers and keeping the workflow organized. Then, just as Frank was wiping his hands on a rag after finishing the day's last oil change, a familiar black luxury car pulled into the lot. Greg! He stepped out, his expression unreadable for a moment as he surveyed the busy shop, the lot full of cars waiting to be serviced, the customers chatting happily with Tom. For a second, something flashed across his face, surprise, perhaps even a hint of respect, before his features hardened again. Frank straightened, ready for another confrontation, but this time felt different. Greg walked up to him slowly, the usual swagger gone from his step. You proved your point, Greg said, his voice low. Frank crossed his arms. Did I? Greg exhaled, glancing around at the thriving business. You took everything I built. Frank shook his head. No, you destroyed what you built. I just gave people another option. Greg stared at him for a long moment, and Frank could see the calculations happening behind his eyes, the realization that he had miscalculated, that his attempt to eliminate competition had backfired spectacularly. The investors are pulling out, Greg finally admitted. They've seen the drop in business, heard the complaints. Carter's reputation is... He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Frank felt no satisfaction at Greg's downfall, only a quiet acknowledgement that integrity had its own reward. It didn't have to be this way, Frank said simply. Greg nodded slightly, then without another word, turned and walked back to his car. As he drove away, Frank watched until the taillights disappeared around the corner. Tom approached, standing beside Frank. What did he want? To concede, Frank said quietly. Tom raised an eyebrow. Really? Just like that. The market spoke. People vote with their wallets and their trust. Frank turned back to the garage. Come on, we've got work to do. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the newly painted sign reading Honest Mechanics, Frank and Tom stood in the doorway of their shop. Danny was inside, carefully cleaning tools and organizing the workspace just as Frank had taught him. You did it, Tom said, pride evident in his voice. Frank looked around at the shop, the customers who had trusted them, the community that had rallied around them. He thought about the journey, from being fired after 30 years of service to building something new, something better. No, he said, smiling. We did it. The next morning, as Frank unlocked the shop door, he noticed something different. The weight that had been pressing on his shoulders since the day Greg fired him was gone. In its place was something he hadn't felt in years, excitement for the day ahead, for the cars he would fix, the people he would help. As he flipped the sign from closed to open, he caught his reflection in the glass. The same weathered face, the same calloused hands, but different eyes. Eyes that no longer looked backward at what he had lost, but forward at what he had built. The phone rang. The day's first customer pulled in. Danny arrived, eager to learn more. And Frank Sullivan, master mechanic, rolled up his sleeves and got to work. Not as an employee, but as an owner. Not as someone who could be discarded, but as someone who had created his own value, his own legacy. The lesson was powerful. Integrity and hard work always win in the end. Frank had dedicated 30 years of his life to his craft, only to be discarded without a second thought. But instead of giving up, he stood his ground, rebuilt himself, and earned the respect of an entire town. His journey proved that when you do the right thing, people notice, and support will come in ways you never expect. Greg, on the other hand, thought power and greed would protect him. He believed he could destroy someone's future without consequences. But in the end, he lost everything. Not because Frank fought him, but because his own dishonesty caught up with him. As Frank guided Danny through the intricacies of timing belt replacement, he realized he had found something he never expected. Not just a new beginning, but a chance to pass on his knowledge, to ensure that the values of honest work and integrity would continue long after he was gone. And that perhaps was the greatest victory of all.